Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Honor to him, the Blessed One, the Worthy One, the fully enlightened One. My utmost respect to the perfectly enlightened Samma Sambuddha, the noble doctrine of the Buddha, and the noble Mahasangha, the disciples of the Buddha. Hello, dear Dhamma friends. Welcome to the lecture number 3 of our guest lecture series. Under this weekly guest lecture series, we will cover up more current and modern topics related to Buddhism to help benefit our community around the world. I certainly believe this effort by Dhamma USA is going to help the community to apply Buddhist teachings in a more practical level. Today we have invited another distinguished scholar and personal friend of mine to this special guest lecture series, and I'm just waiting for him to join. He's got some technical issues. I hope he will be here soon with us. So, Professor Tom Moritz, a person whom I know personally, we have been working together at the University of the West, and Professor Tom Moritz also has been a remarkable person, both as a Buddhist practitioner and also as a wonderful, kind-hearted man, and also a good scholar. So, Professor Tom Moritz, as we have learned about him actually in his resume, he has been working in many areas, not only as a person who has been working in this sustainability, and I'm also very interested in his contribution towards the environmental studies. And Professor Tom Moritz also has been working as a librarian, so he's more into information technology as well. Very well experienced. And so let me see how he is going to be with us in a few moments. Hello, Dhamma friends. Good evening again. And finally, we could connect to Professor Tom Moritz, and he is here with us. And hello, Professor Tom Moritz. Yeah. So sorry for the issue we had with the technical side, but I'm happy that finally we could connect you to our series of special guest lectures. And so I would like to say welcome to the lecture 4 of our guest lecture series. Under this weekly guest lecture series, we will cover up more current and modern topics related to Buddhism as well. So today we invited Professor Tom Moritz, who has kindly accepted our invitation to talk about equanimity and sustainability. A very good evening and greeting, Professor Thomas Daniel Tom Moritz. And we warmly welcome you to this special guest series on behalf of Dhamma USA. Glad to meet you after a while. How are you doing this day? I think you are mute.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect. So sorry.
Okay, everything is okay. Yeah, and so sorry for the inconvenience caused, but I'm so happy finally we were connected. So do you, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you now, Bhante.
Okay. So I still remember we were co-teaching and introduction to Buddhist psychology course at the University of the West. It was a wonderful experience to work with a very well experienced, kind-hearted, and good Buddhist practitioner like you. Would you like to share a few words about your introduction to Buddhism? I'm sure our audience will be very glad to hear about you more.
I'd be very happy to do that. All right. So, is my audio all right at this point?
Yes.
Okay,
I
good. You know, it's an interesting story in my case. My family went to live in China in 1948.
Wow.
And we lived in Beijing, and we lived on a street, for those who may speak some Chinese, is Da Bo Zi, which meant Big Temple Street.
Okay.
So when I was 2 years old, my parents would take me to the temple, which was actually a Tibetan Gelugpa temple.
Oh.
And the monks would take me and put me up in the lap of the Buddha. When I was
So
only 2 years.
You were just 2 years old that time.
When I was only 2 years old.
Wow.
Yeah. and so the point of that, in a way, is that I grew up around Chinese culture, but also was aware of Buddhism from a very early age. But my own story with respect to Buddhism, but my family was a Christian family. I was raised in the Anglican Episcopal Church, but my family. So I was, and that was through my teenage years. But in the 1960s, suddenly in 1968, my father died. So I was only 21 years old, and I was unprepared and was unable to satisfy the feelings that I had at the time. My concern for myself, of course, but my mother and my sisters. And I couldn't understand those in the traditional Christian terms that I was being offered at that time. And so I had been studying Buddhism in college, and I also was aware of Buddhism from other sources as well. And I began to really identify. So as early, and I had started to meditate in 1966. Actually, it started with Quakers. But in Quaker meetings, it was quite common to have Buddhists appear with their cushions and sit in the corner in the Quaker meeting. And so I became really interested and fascinated with Buddhism and with meditation practice particularly. So from roughly that time, certainly in the 1970s all the way to now, I have continued to pursue Buddhist meditation. And part of my own story is that I had a substance abuse problem, but in 1987, I stopped that entirely. And from that time on, my meditation really was enhanced and grew much stronger. I worked with, I was part of the Buddhist Peace Fellowship. I took workshops with Thich Nhat Hanh. I took a whole variety, actually did a pilgrimage around the United States and visited Buddhist practice centers. And so I was introduced to many different types of Buddhist practice. And ever since then, I've continued to stay active. I was involved in the Buddhist Recovery Network. I was a facilitator for that international body. Bhikkhu Bodhi had me serve on the board of Buddhist Global Relief, which I did for a number of years. And Bhikkhu Bodhi, I consider Bhikkhu Bodhi to be one of my senior teachers. So, and then of course, as you know, Bhante, I've been teaching at University of the West. I think this 9.5 years I've been teaching.
Yeah, how many years?
9.5 years.
Wow. Yeah, no wonder everyone loves your teaching. I also remember we went to the Whittier Nature's Center last time with some students to watch birds and other animals to inspire the students.
That's right. I have a picture. I have a picture of you, Bhante, with a possum, I think.
I know. Blind one, right?
That's right.
So we were mindfully walking, looking for birds and wild animals. We started with a loving kindness meditation, followed by a walking meditation, and it was really interesting that everyone was so respectful and mindful while peacefully walking in the wilderness. I know you have been teaching quite a few courses on nature-related topics. What made you become so interested to become a nature lover?
That's a good question. I grew up in the suburbs of New York and also in the suburbs of Southern California, right here in Los Angeles area. And my family went to national parks. We traveled a lot in the summer. So I visited many different national parks.
Okay.
I was a Boy Scout when I was young, and I did trail work in the San Gabriel Mountains, just above where we live, just above, actually, when I teaches my class at US, I point to the mountains up there and say, you know, when I was 15, I was up there doing work on trails, you know, and so nature has been important to me all my life. And then professionally, I became involved in several different ways with the environment, with nature. I worked in graduate school. I did a project at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. I also did work with the I was paid to work in the library at the U.S. Department of the Interior in Washington, D.C. I did some work later as a graduate student at the University of Washington with the U.S. Forest Service. And then eventually I worked at a marine lab, and I was certified as a research diver at a marine lab in the San Juan Islands. So I've been very actively involved with nature, both on dry land and in the ocean for a long time, you know, and it's always touched my heart. As I hope I'll say a little later, I have a very deep affection for animals and for the natural world.
Yeah. And I personally would like to invite you later on, maybe if we have time. I remember you were chanting the Karaniya Metta Sutta in English, while I was chanting in Pali in our interfaith prayers and at the University of the West. I remember that was so wonderful. Yeah, hopefully we can do it today.
I'd be happy to do that if we have time.
Yeah. Yes. So I know, you have such impressive resume I was going through, and I would like to invite audience to go through that wonderful resume is posted in our website. So you're going to talk about equanimity and sustainability. And so very interested. I'm sure our audience will be very happy to learn more about equanimity and sustainability. Let's see how Professor Moritz what he has to offer today in defending this interesting topic. Dear Dhamma friends, we also would like to invite you to mark your calendar every Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific time to get more benefited from this guest lecture series. Kindly check with Dhamma USA YouTube channel and Facebook page and Facebook groups for more updates. We simultaneously broadcasting this talk in over 8 platforms. So I think many people can be benefited. I'm pretty sure you are all going to enjoy this topic today, that is equanimity and sustainability. Kindly post your questions in the comment section of Dhamma USA YouTube channel so that Professor Moritz can answer them at the end of the talk. Without further ado, let me invite Professor Thomas Daniel Moritz to start
All
his
right.
presentation on
Thank you,
equanimity
Bud.
and sustainability.
I'm working on, there we go. Good. Excellent. Okay, you can see that slide, I hope. Yes?
Yes, we can see that.
All right, good. Thank you. So I'm starting with this image because we have, since the time of the Buddha, we have learned a tremendous amount about our universe that we live in. The Vedic tradition in India actually had some amazing insights about the nature of the universe itself. The Buddha himself tended to avoid being involved in those sorts of discussions. In fact, he often was very, very clear that, let's see if I can, here we go. The Buddha said, I teach one thing and one thing only, suffering and the end of suffering. And that was, in my opinion, Buddhism is a fundamentally psychological religion. It's part of a great wisdom tradition, but certainly one of the deepest and most profound teachings about human psychology. And that was 2,500 years ago. In the 2,500 years since the Buddha, we have gained a great deal of new information and insight, both about human beings, ourselves, but certainly about other beings that we share the earth with, and also, of course, about the universe and the cosmos. The Four Noble Truths, I'm going to just very briefly go through these because I know most of our audience knows this. Suffering is the first noble truth. There is a cause of suffering, there is an end to suffering, and there is a path. And I'm going to make clear in my brief talk here that I consider very often when we translate from Pali, for example, into English, it's often valuable to incorporate a whole cluster of terms rather than insisting on one particular term. I think the term, as I hope to make clear, I think the term suffering is not really adequate to understand the full range of the problem that the Buddha was diagnosing and addressing. This is the Eightfold Path. Of course, most people are aware of that. Right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And Thich Nhat Hanh, who was one of my teachers, produced this as an alternative way of representing both the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. And one of the pieces of wisdom that I gained from working with him in a variety of workshops was that often these elements are not necessarily linear, but they interoperate in a variety of ways. We could talk about that later if we'd like to. These, of course, are some of the fundamental thought subjects for frequent recollection in Buddhism. I'm of the nature to age. I've not gone beyond aging. I'm 75 now, so I look at my hands and I say, how did I get old man hands on the end of my arms? I'm of the nature to sicken, but I've not gone beyond sickness. In my own case, I've been relatively fortunate so far. But of course, all beings, including the Buddha himself, are subject to sickness and were subject to sickness. And I'm also of the nature to die. I've not gone beyond that. And I want to make very clear, this is not in any respect a morbid reflection. This is simply a statement of the fact. This is the way the world is. It's not morbidly reflecting in any respect. It's simply saying, this is the reality of the world. And when we accept this reality and come to terms with it, it can have a transformative effect on us. These are what are often called the three Dhamma seals or factors or conditions of existence. The first one is suffering, which we've already touched on. The second one is anicca, which is to say that everything is impermanent or change. Everything is subject to conditions. And anatta, or not self, I also like the word insubstantiality. So those are the factors of existence. So when we talk about, the Buddha said, I'm here to relieve suffering. Very often in English, when we hear that word suffering, we have a tendency to think of it in a very narrow way, as if it has a very particular type of extreme meaning, extreme pain, extreme desolation or sadness or despair or grief. But in fact, I believe it's healthier if we understand suffering or dukkha to represent a whole variety of values. This is pointed to in part by a consideration of the four worldly dhammas: pleasure and pain, gain and loss, praise and blame, reputation and disrepute. And it's a Buddhist insight that all human beings are subject to these concerns, unless they understand them and recollect and understand how to respond to these when they feel these impulses. But here's a slide that I have found very, very helpful. This comes from the Buddhist Publication Society, where, by the way, Bhikkhu Bodhi was editor for years and years. And dukkha, or suffering, is defined as disturbance, irritation, dejection, worry, fear, despair, dread, anguish, anxiety, vulnerability, injury, inability, inferiority, sickness, aging, decay of the body and faculties, senility, pain, pleasure, excitement, boredom, and so forth and so forth. In other words, what Francis' story is offering us in this definition is virtually the entire range of human emotive responses to the world. Virtually the entire range. And it's very challenging when we realize that, and it's fundamental to what I'm hoping to talk about right now, which is that when we are experiencing all of these things, we are not in a state of balance and peace and harmony. All of these factors interfere or disrupt our basic capacity to experience life with balance and with other fundamental values like the Brahma Viharas: loving kindness, compassion, and sympathetic joy. All right. So, of course, we also have 5 fundamental ethical precepts, the Buddhist precepts being, Bhikkhu Bodhi reduces them to 5 terms: harmlessness, honesty, faithfulness, truthfulness, and sobriety. But I've slightly changed the 4th precept. I'm calling it non-deceit. And on the right-hand side of this slide, I'm talking about the positive values that I should turn off my phone. Sorry, fellas, my friends. So that there are 5 positive values that correspond to those ethical precepts. In addition, and to these are actually at the essence of what I want to say today, we have what are called the Brahma Viharas. Christina Feldman, an excellent insight meditation teacher who's based in England, has offered us a wonderful book called Boundless Heart, which discusses these. But the 4 Brahma Viharas, or divine abodes, are metta, loving kindness, karuna, compassion, mudita, sympathetic joy, or upekkha, equanimity. And I want to stress that upekkha, or equanimity, is the balancing factor for the first 3. We can talk about that a little bit more later. And I'm not going to talk, these are the paramitas, or perfections. I'm not going to talk about these at this moment, but we will talk about them later. So, what is the situation that we find ourselves in as human beings in the world? And there's a wonderful sutta called the Ratapala Sutta, which talks about the 4 Dharma summaries. In that summary, this is the monk Ratapala explaining to a king at the time in India, and he's offering these as 4 essentials to Buddhism. One is the world is swept away, it does not endure. This is a way of saying that the entire world, everything that we know, is inconstant and unstable, and ultimately will all be swept away. And by the way, this seems to be very, very consistent with what we now understand about the Big Bang in our universe, and about what may have been cycles of contraction and explosion, That corresponds very closely to Vedic traditions in India, going back probably at least 3,000 years. The second of the Dhamma summaries is the world is without shelter. and there is no one in charge. There is no protector. There is no one that's going to save us from that condition of instability, and there is ultimately no way that we can escape those realities of old age, sickness, and death. The world is without ownership. We cannot attach ourselves to things. One has to pass on, leaving everything behind. That's the third Dharma summary. And finally, the world is insufficient, insatiable, a slave to craving. Now, one could take this and feel that it's very, very negative, but what it does do is it leaves us in a place where the truth and accepting the truth of the Dhamma does allow us to live with balance and equanimity, and to realize a fundamental truth in our own hearts, the truth of tenderness and love and compassion, sympathetic joy, the Brahma-Viharas. We can find a way to live in the world with greater compassion and love if we simply accept the reality of that. So this takes us more to my more general concern, which has to do with what do we mean when we look beyond our individual condition, or even if we look at our individual condition, what do we mean by health, or balance, or equanimity, or equilibrium? And the World Health Organization says health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. It's not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. This is a very, very important concept, a very inclusive concept. And as we think about it, I believe this is what the Buddha was pointing to for all beings on the planet, certainly for human beings, for all beings, that what he was making available to us was the capacity to come to a complete understanding of physical, mental, and social well-being, and to live with equanimity, with balance, holding those values in our lives. That's an incredibly important offer. It's an incredibly, in economic terms, they might call that a value proposition, but it's a very, very important and essential offering. It means all of us can find health in the sense of physical, mental, and social well-being. And of course, the question that flows from that is, why do we not? What are the obstacles to that? And yet, the potential for equanimity and balance operates at all scales. In our bodies, it operates in each individual human body. By the way, just to be clear, the human body is not a discrete, constant, and stable entity. We know, for example, biologically, that there are at least 10,000 different species of organisms that may occupy the human body. Many of those are microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, amoeba, a variety of things. But up to 10,000 species, not individual organisms, but species occupy we are essentially a two-legged ecosystem walking around. And how do we maintain equanimity within our own bodies, right? Not even looking at the larger environment, or the social environment, the environment of the natural environment. How is it that we maintain equilibrium in that situation? So here's my essential proposition. And essentially, the quality that we use, the description of the mechanism that maintains our equilibrium in our bodies is called homeostasis. It's the tendency to try and adjust. Any of us that have ever had a fever have experienced what it means to be slightly out of balance. A fever is an indicator that our system is not in balance. 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit is the average temperature for a human being. Homeostasis is we often talk about it as an immune response that our bodies make when any external influence, a microbe, a virus, a bacteria, leads us to be out of balance, and our system is seeking, and we have a lot of experience, of course, with this in the last 3 years with the COVID epidemic worldwide. By the way, 610 million people, by a modest World Health Organization estimate, have had COVID in the last 3 years. 610 million. That's roughly 1/10 of the human beings on the planet, and that's almost certainly an underestimate. So homeostasis is that, and of those 610 million, approximately 6.5 million people have died. So it's been, and that's just one pandemic. And there have been more in the past, there have been much larger ones, and there will be more in the future. And so homeostasis is that pattern that leads us to try and find a way to balance and reestablish equilibrium in our individual bodies. And in the case of COVID, we've also involved something called heterostasis, which means using vaccines and treatments of a variety of sorts to help our bodies restore that balance. But we're also looking at a much larger question of socio and cultural harmony and equity and balance. There have been a whole variety that continue to be on an international, national, local community scale, a variety of disrupting elements that basically throw us into disequity or disharmony. And so part of the goal for health, for planetary health, is to find cultural, socio-cultural harmony and equity. And then the third part has to do with the economic and ecological balance that we find in the world. And this has to do with our relationship to all animate beings, plants and animals, but also ultimately to the earth itself, to the planetary systems like climate that have sustained us, that have been the conditions for our evolution. I thought I might mention here that I don't know how many people know it, but by best estimates, 1.2 million years ago, there were only probably about 25,000 human beings on the planet, our ancestors, 25,000, a very small village or city, a city here in the United States. And so we are now at close to 7 billion, and finding the ability to maintain an appropriate balance with population at that level to minimize the destructive impacts of on our planet, our animate, our fellow beings, our sangha of all beings, our kinship with all beings, and also the earth itself is a fundamental task. So that's my concept of planetary health, an inclusive concept that goes from the individual, from each of us, all the way out to the full global scale of the planet. And the question becomes, how do we do that? So I'm going to skip ahead. We have to re-examine our existing assumptions. We need to recalibrate knowledge, constantly introduce more knowledge and information. And we need to bring to the practice our deepest spiritual practice, particularly of mindfulness, of awareness. Okay. So here is a delightful article by Zumski, sorry, my Polish is not great, but Wisła, called The Impact of Sustainability. And he's looking at sustainability on the social environment and as a matter of survival. And I'll just read the very brief introduction. The survival of social groups depends on internal factors, the size of their group, its socio-diversity, its inner organization, its coherence and synergy of actions for the common good. External factors, mostly on the safe, natural, and social environment, and on sustainable interactions with the environment. The survival and development of groups is determined by their stability, which in turn depends on the homeostatic mechanisms that maintain a state of balance within groups. So here he's doing what I've been trying to do, which is extending that definition of homeostasis to include our interactions with the entire planet. Sorry guys, let me just turn on my light here. Here in Los Angeles, it's getting dark. so I was sorry for that.
Now you look more visible.
Thank you. I don't look as sinister as I did when I was in the dark there. So thank you. So, so in this context, what I now also want to introduce with some of the World Health Organization, this is a typology of violence. And why am I talking about violence? Because violence represents a disruptive element at virtually every level. And this typology of violence gives a very good indication. And by the way, just for the record, it recognizes 4 major categories of violence. This is from the World Health Organization: physical, sexual, psychological, that is, could be said to be emotional, and also deprivation or neglect. So in therapeutic terms, we often call that an attachment disturbance, when any being, whether it's a human being or any other being, fails to receive the necessary care it requires as a young being. And that's often called an attachment disturbance. And then in addition, here's a whole typology going from I'm having a hard time reading my own slide, self-directed violence, which can include suicide or self-abuse, interpersonal violence, which can include families and partners or communities, children, partners, elders, acquaintances, and strangers, and then collective violence, which is something we're seeing right now on our planet a lot, which includes social, political, economic, and of course warfare is one of the greatest examples of that. So why am I bringing this in at this point? Because these are the most glaring, the most obvious symptoms of the disequilibrium that we still experience on our planet as human beings and in our relationships to nature and to the natural world. And here's another useful slide which graphically represents this distinction here between the individual, the relationships most intimately in our lives, our communities, and then beyond that, our broader societal connections. So this disturbance is, I'm using violence as a trope for the overall disequilibrium or disturbance that we as a species are experiencing on the planet. And by the way, it goes beyond this. If I were designing this, I would add one more large circle beyond the societal to include the environmental, which would include all beings and our relationship to the planet itself. For example, to climate, all of that. So I would add one more loop here, but this comes directly from the World Health Organization. So I'm not going to go into great detail here, but the first level of ecological model identifies biological and personal history factors. In addition to biological and demographic factors such as impulsivity, low educational attainment, substance abuse, history of prior aggression and abuse are all considered. So an individual who has suffered from any of these is greatly at risk for disequilibrium, or for, as I mentioned earlier, self-inflicted violence or self-abuse. In addition, at the relationship level, our proximal social relationships, that means our families, our parents, our siblings, our children, our peers. These are the people that we have the most consistent over our lifetimes, the most consistent interactions with. And where in these contexts, these local relationship contexts, these proximal social relationships, we've experienced harm or violence, there's a strong tendency for that tendency to be harmful or to be violent in that context to continue. It's in other words, there are lineages of violence. My friends that work, do social work, particularly those that work with prisoners or others who have been subject to a lot of violence in their lives and have been perpetrators of violence, say hurt people hurt people. That's a very, very important concept. But again, that's a part of the lineage of disequilibrium that we receive in our lives. People who are suffering in the world are often suffering because they have been injured themselves, been hurt themselves, or perhaps going back even generations, there has been injury that has been passed down as a lineage from family, through families, from parents to children, and so forth. So that's the relationship level. Then in addition, there's the community level, which occurs when communities or cultures develop certain patterns. One of the most obvious ones here in the United States that many of us are familiar with has to do with housing, with discrimination in housing. And people have been essentially segregated. They have not been permitted to find housing where they need it. And often it's worse than that. Sometimes people, because of the inability to find adequate housing, are forced out onto the streets. And here in Los Angeles, we have a horrible problem, a terrible problem with homeless people, people who cannot find, they're unsheltered, and they end up living literally on the sidewalks or in the streets. And This is one example of a community level response, a community level problem, but there are many others that follow from that as well. I'm not going to try and go into all of that, but areas of poverty or physical deterioration, people do not have good shelter, they do not have access to good food, they often do not have access to clean water, they often do not have access to good air. And by the way, those negative values, those negative qualities in those neighborhoods do not necessarily exist in the wealthier neighborhoods. Right here in Los Angeles, very often the communities that are wealthiest are out by the ocean, where the air is cleaner and clearer, where the water quality has been improved to the degree that they're not subject to the same dilemmas of water pollution. For example, lead in water. We know that's been happening all over the world, and certainly in the United States. So that's the community level problem. Then we go out to the societal problem, and here we come to a series of societal norms that operate. And here in the United States, we could take this level to be primarily a national problem. Cultural norms that support violence as an acceptable way to resolve conflict. Attitudes that regard suicide as a matter of individual choice instead of a preventable act of violence. Norms that give priority to parental rights over child welfare. Norms that enrich male dominance over women and children. Norms that use support of excess force by police against citizens. These are all problems that exist at the societal level, and again they're disequilibrating. They unbalance individuals, they unbalance societies. And then beyond all these, as I said earlier, the World Health Organization slide that I showed a little earlier goes out to the societal level, but then the question becomes, what about the environmental level? And what is happening, and what are the consequences of environmental disruption? Some simple questions. I was laughing with Bhante about, I have a picture of him with a possum. A little possum came up to him and was right at his feet. And I believe he was able to pet it. It was a tame possum. For those of you who are not in the United States, that's a local marsupial species here in the United States, very common here. And Bhante and I helped lead a walk on the campus of our university. We've got some skilled bird watchers to come over to the university, and we did a walk with a bird as we were doing birding. And on our little campus in Rosemead, California, we were able to, that morning, to identify 35 separate species of birds. And less than a mile from our campus, simply across Walnut Grove Avenue, if you know Rosemead, there's a stream called the Rio Hondo. And along that stream, there's a little bird called the least bell's vireo, which is tiny, probably not much bigger than that. But it migrates every year from Rio Hondo, all the way down to Baja California. And so that bird is an endangered species. And so the environmental question is really, what does it matter? A lot of people, a lot of Americans, a lot of other people say, well, what does that little bird matter? Why does it matter? Why do we care if that little bird exists or doesn't exist? And that's a fair question for all of us to ask ourselves. For me, it's part of the miracle of creation, the miracle of natural selection, which is something I love, and karma, which is a Buddhist value. In my opinion, natural selection is a type of karma. We could talk about that. We could spend entire classes talking about that.
Professor Moritz,
Yes.
you were talking about the birds.
Yes.
I remember there was one bird who can actually replicate many sounds. Like I heard like 30 plus sounds.
That's right. Yeah,
What
a mockingbird. It's a mockingbird, and it's a corvid. It's in the crow family, and it has the ability to imitate the songs of many, many other birds.
That's
very smart. In fact, by the way, Bhante, we this week we've gotten information about the intelligence of the corvids are crows, ravens, mockingbirds, blue jays, and magpies. Those are the central birds that most people know. They have a special intelligence that's roughly equivalent to the prefrontal cortex in human beings. We've got some very new science that suggests that they have a capacity for self-awareness and for intelligence in the same way that human beings do. And we didn't know it. We didn't really understand that. But mockingbirds are the birds you're thinking of.
Yeah. Ever since we went that day, after that, I was always watching birds, and I was very curious about like this mockingbird.
That's right. Well, they're
Amazing.
very funny. They're very funny. You can actually even whistle a song, and they can pick up your song.
Oh
I
wow.
don't want to. I don't want to frighten anyone, but when I was in Washington D.C., I whistled the International, which is a ballad, a communist ballad, just for fun to see if the mockingbird could pick it up, and it did. So they're indiscriminate. They're not political, so I want to make that clear. But it was just funny to see if they could pick up a tune like that.
Mm-hmm. There is a similar bird in Sri Lanka, like we call it myna. I think it is like a magpie or something.
A myna bird. That's right. Yeah,
Yeah,
they're very intelligent also. Yeah, and
yeah,
they've
they
come.
can also speak.
They
And the
exist in Hawaii. They've come to Hawaii. There are myna birds in Hawaii as well. Yeah.
Mhm. But
Yeah.
this particular bird is, I think, stand above the rest.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I'll just quickly finish here. These are some of the behavioral health consequences of violence. Their physical consequences, mental health, sexual and reproductive health, and also chronic disease. We know statistically that any young people, any young human beings who have suffered violence in their homes as they were growing up are much more susceptible to all of these problems. So there have been extensive studies to just explain that. So and by the way, so the point here is to say that all of these factors, including the environmental factors that I was just talking about, are forms of disequilibrium. And the point that I'm making, and the equanimity as one of the 4 Brahma Viharas, the balancing element in the Brahma Viharas, allows us to find the way to live our lives with loving kindness, compassion, and sympathetic joy, and to balance those values in our lives, and to minimize the harm that we do, to minimize the degree to which we continue to compound the problem, to make the problem worse. So I'm going to just close up here. This is a quote from the Canadian environmentalist David Suzuki. He tells a story about the Chiwang people in Malaysia, and in the story, it's a myth, but probably based in some kind of truth. But there's a tiger who's stalking a family, and is voracious and terrified the family, and the shaman of this tribe manages to trap the tiger and to kill it. But instead of letting it die, using his shamanic powers, he breathes life into the tiger and asks, "Why did you want to eat us?" And the tiger in this story answers, "All I saw was meat. All I saw was meat." And how many human beings on this planet have exactly that same value when they go to McDonald's, or go get a burger, or go get a hot dog, or sit down for a big breakfast of bacon and eggs? How many human beings are simply not seeing anything but what's on their plate? And that question of kindness and generosity to all animals, I'm talking here, of course, about domestic animals, but it extends to all animals, all beings on this planet, and our ability to answer the question, is all we're seeing meat? And I'll close up with this. This is the monk Jiaozhou, also known as Joshu in Japanese. This is from the Zen tradition. And this is a Zen koan. Jiaozhou was asked, does a dog have Buddha nature? Does a dog have Buddha nature? And this was asked about the year 800. So probably, what does that make it, 1,300 years ago? Chinese monks were considering the problem of whether dogs had consciousness, whether they had personalities, whether they had Buddha nature. And Jiaozhou's answer was cryptic. He said mu, and mu could mean in Chinese no, could mean he could be answering the question directly, or it could be not. He could be rejecting the question as foolish. Of course, koan practice takes us well beyond that. But I'm pointing this out simply because this is from the Zen tradition and shows that even at this time, 1,300 years ago, monks were struggling with this question of what do our fellow beings actually, who are our fellow beings? What is the nature of their personalities? And do they deserve the same respect that we grant ourselves, we hopefully grant ourselves? And I'm not going to spend a lot of time. That's a picture of Jiaozhou. I'm not going to go into these, but I will say this: some neuroscientists very recently This was at Cambridge University about 8 or 10 years ago. Came up with the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, and they said basically humans are not unique in possessing the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. So there's a scientific answer to Jiao Zhou's koan. And I touched on that already. So I'm just going to close up here saying that as human beings who are striving to follow the Dhamma, follow the Buddhist teachings, we have the 5 basic precepts: harmlessness, honesty, faithfulness, non-deceit, and sobriety. And their positive virtues: loving kindness, generosity, contentment, truth, and mindfulness, cultivation of clarity of mind. And in addition, we have the paramitas, or perfections: generosity, virtue, renunciation, discernment, equanimity, patience, persistence, truth, determination, goodwill. These are all positive values that come directly from the Buddhist tradition. And then in addition, this is something Bhikkhu Bodhi pointed out to me, and I think very few people, most of us are aware of the mundane system of dependent arising, the 12 aspects of dependent arising: ignorance, karma formation, consciousness, mentality, nama-rupa, mentality, materiality, sixfold sense base, the khandhas plus consciousness, contact, feeling, craving, clinging, existence, and birth. But the exciting part, and this is a very, very little known sutta called the Upanisa Sutta, which is called transcendent arising. And it goes from faith, joy, rapture, tranquility, happiness, concentration, knowledge and vision, disenchantment, that is being lucid in the world, dispassion, emancipation, and knowledge of the destruction of the taints or the cankers. So there's this is a very, very hopeful sutta, and it's very, very little understood or very little discussed in most Buddhist circles. So that brings an end to my topic. I just want to thank Bhante so much for the opportunity to present this to you. Sorry for our technical difficulties at the outset. And also, I want to make clear that what I've given you is roughly almost a first draft of a larger thesis that I'm working on. Not that I'm in graduate school, but I'm working on this general thesis. And it's going to incorporate many of the thoughts that I've expressed to you tonight, but also many, many other additional things. It may actually end up being a book. I'm not sure yet. So thank you, Bhante. Thank you so much for your invitation.
Thank you so much, Professor Moritz, for this interesting presentation on equanimity and sustainability. I would definitely like to hear from you again with some other topics, as you are such a resourceful and knowledgeable person in a number of fields.
Thank you, Bhante.
Yeah, I'm sure all our Dhamma friends around the world were benefited today, and we will take up your questions now, and we encourage you to post your questions through the Dhamma USA YouTube channel or any other social media platform. Having said that, Professor Moritz, and so you were talking about the sustainability and equanimity. And also, I really like your enormous experience in so many real-time, lifetime experiences that you had undergone. As you were saying about how you yourself were struggling at the beginning, and you cope up with them, and later on you became an advocate to help many people who were suffering. I think that would be something that I would like to hear from you a little bit more to inspire our younger generation in particular, and also the other people who have been suffering due to many reasons. Would you like to say a few words about this?
Yes, thank you, Bhante. Each of those areas, I think I've been involved in each of the areas that I talked about when I was talking about, I was using violence as the example, but from the personal level, all the way up through the family, the relationship level, to the community, to the societal scale, and even to the environmental scale. I can give you a few examples. in my own personal life, one of the things I've been doing, as you know, Bhante, because you went down to Homeboy Industries with me, Father Greg Boyle at Homeboy Industries in downtown Los Angeles. It's a program that's been set up. It's a full community service program that's meant to offer support to men and women who have been involved in gangs and also who have been in prison. And as you know, Bhante, because I brought you there, we have been working on meditation courses for them for I think it's 7 or 8 years now. I should go back and count, but I think it's 7 years at least, maybe 8 years.
We should go
teach
back.
meditation. Yeah, and you participated. It was very important for them to see a monk in robes. And as you know, most of those young men and women are fully they have many tattoos. They've been in very violent, very rough settings. They've been in prison. They've been in gangs. And we're trying to teach them the value of meditation and mindfulness in a spiritual context and giving them some sense of peace in their hearts. So that's certainly one way. But my own personal life, I've also been involved with conservation work at the international scale with endangered species and protected areas, our national parks, trying to create areas that are where habitat for endangered species is secure. And that includes, by the way, in the water, in the ocean, but also on land. So I have been involved to a very extensive degree all over the planet. I can tell you one quick story. I was working in Russia, and a protected area manager from Siberia, a young Russian guy, came to me and said he was really worried because he had a protected area in Siberia, and they had snow leopards there. Snow leopards are beautiful big cats. I didn't even know they existed in Siberia, but he said, my manager wants to license hunting of these snow leopards. And he asked me, what can we do about it? And we didn't have a good example except to say that we can try and promote the values of preservation of species and promote tourism rather than hunting, rather than going in and killing the animals, encouraging people to come in to see the animals if possible, and encouraging what we call ecotourism. But that's just one little example. I've worked been down to South Africa 5 times in a whole variety of ways. I've traveled to Russia, the South Pacific, many times to Europe and around South America also. All of that is in the interest of explaining to people and teaching people about the availability of knowledge that can be applied at the local level, at the grassroots level. So I'm not sure that's an adequate answer to your question. But,
okay. Yes, I think I'm very interested in restarting this Los Angeles Homeboys thing again.
Absolutely.
Are you still visiting there?
I still am going down there, yes.
Okay. I'm sure like during the pandemic, it was like not functioning properly. Maybe a lot of people.
We had some problems, but I did continue to go down. In fact, I was going to the main headquarters in downtown, but also out on Boyle Heights in the Boyle Heights area, and helping to lead group therapy sessions with teenagers.
All right. So maybe let's schedule another visit there.
We will, for sure. I'd love to do that, Bhante.
I was really touched to see those people who are in need of our help, and yes, practicing loving kindness with them would be really, really helpful.
Yeah.
I remember like I was also going to Tuft Community Correction Center and with Chris, and we also had a really wonderful time. We went like several times actually. I wanted to take you also there. Hopefully we could go again.
I would love to do that. Yeah. And as you know, Bhante, we've had a group at University of the West that's been taking meditation courses in the California State Prison.
Nice.
Our Venerable Dae Hung and others have been going, and Chris, our friend Chris, has been going into. Yeah.
I was going with them. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful.
I was going with them like so many times. That's the one I was talking about. Like maybe we could.
That's right.
We could join. I hope they are okay. But I was really concerned about when it happened to them during the pandemic, and it was so difficult, like with the restrictions, so difficult to go in. And hopefully we could help them more.
You know, Bhante, as you know, there's the story of the Buddha visiting a village and meeting an untouchable in the village. who he
Yes.
drew into the Sangha with him. That Buddhism has always been a socially very, very progressive, reaching out to the least, to those most on the margins of our society and drawing them in. And the Buddha himself was an example of that.
Hmm. So, like during the pandemic, I think a lot of people were having so many issues, right? And how would you relate equanimity and sustainability to such massive scale, personal level and also like community level
Yeah.
disaster? How would we?
Well, actually, I've just finished. I'm teaching this semester a course in the environment, and one of the first big class units I teach is on epidemiology, the history of diseases, and how do diseases occur, and why do they occur, and how do we gain knowledge and understanding not only of the disease but how to treat them. And I think the good news about the COVID period is that our ability to quickly diagnose, to use genetic methods, and to develop medicines, vaccines to treat the disease was very, very rapid by comparison with almost all the other diseases that human beings have dealt with. So that's the good news. The problem, of course, is that in our current environment, we have global communication and global travel. People can move throughout the planet very, very rapidly. And that means that the intensity and the spread of any disease is greatly, greatly increased. So that number that I mentioned, that 610 million people have contracted COVID, and that's a minimal estimate by the World Health Organization, is an instance of that. So there are challenges which come from our population size and our ability to travel and to communicate freely, but there is also great scientific advance. And so what I'm trying to recommend is that we understand the nature, see as clearly as possible the scientific basis for viruses, for viral diseases, for bacterial diseases like cholera, and then the hardest part is not really gaining the scientific knowledge. We have made huge strides there. The hard part is why do we not develop policy based on that knowledge? What I would call wise policy. Why is it that when we understand so much about diseases like cholera, for example, that when the earthquake happened in Haiti in 2012, why did cholera break out in Haiti when we already had the solution from the 1855 or 1860? We already knew what it was, and pretty soon after that, we developed antibiotics. Why did cholera still kill more than 10,000 people in Haiti, and why were we unable to build policies that prevented that from happening? Over several 100,000 people got cholera in Haiti as well, and that's just in the country of Haiti. So what I'm saying is that there is tremendous potential to use wisdom to overcome these imbalancing, equilibrating forces like disease and many, many others, the ones I've already talked about. But the question really becomes, why can we not develop wise policies for all of these problems that I've discussed? And that's the question of how do we build equilibrium into our system? How do we build equity so that there are not particular groups of people that are vulnerable? How do we develop equity in our distribution of health services, of food, of water, of clean air, for that matter? Why are we so slow in being able to do that? And that's the challenge that we all face on this planet. And ultimately, climate change itself, which is affecting the entire planet, the climate of the entire planet, is the sort of the ultimate problem that we're trying to deal with. So equanimity means, how do we use knowledge and insight and mindfulness to understand and then to act skillfully on these problems? That's really what we're talking about. And of course, there's a huge amount to say about that.
So do you have any particular reference through Buddhism that we can cope up with such situations?
Well, it's interesting you should ask. The Emperor Ashoka was a wonderful example. The Emperor Ashoka, who was the last of the Mauryan emperors in India, he was a great warrior who converted to Buddhism. One of the things that, I know you know this, Bhante, but Ashoka built stelae or pillars around the edge of his empire that included his edicts. One of his edicts was that every human being in his realm should have complete medical care. But not only that, he said not only should the human beings have medical care, but the animals should have medical care. And that was about 2,400 years ago. The Emperor Ashoka was a Buddhist emperor who did, using the best available medicines at the time, try to extend that to all beings essentially in his empire. So there are clearly models for, but how do we, the problem we've got is we live in a society and we live in an economy which too often seems to be to ignore the people that are most vulnerable. And of course, the question becomes, how do we support and relieve the suffering of those people particularly? Mm-hmm. How do we bring wisdom to our social and political practices at every level, from a city level through the county, the state, the nation, and actually a global scale? And so that's the fundamental problem. My best suggestion is to use calm explanation and patient explanation of the realities of the world, of the reality of vulnerability and suffering, and then to present as clearly as possible what the available solutions are. And that happens at every level, from our city councils in a particular city all the way up to the United Nations General Assembly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I wish I had a better answer.
Yes. And also, as a university professor, I know you have been teaching at the University of the West. That is my favorite university as well. Such a wonderful place. But then for several years, we couldn't go there in person, and we had to teach online. And then the students were also not really, they were not able to, focus properly. And I remember, like, once I was teaching a course, and some students in South Korea in the middle of the night, and then some in Taiwan, and then again early morning, and mainland China. So they had a lot of time issue and time zone difference, and also it was always challenging. So how did you cope up with that?
Well, yeah, it was very frustrating. I did have students in Taiwan, by the way, who were logging into my class. It was 2 a.m. their time, I believe. So I was so grateful and respectful of their effort, the seriousness of their effort. Mm-hmm. But it was very hard to be in the Zoom environment. I'm actually, a whole part of my life that we haven't talked about is that I was very actively involved with information technology, with the U.S. National Science Foundation. I had a very large grant with foundations as well. But it's just very, very hard. It was disruptive for everyone, and it was a disequilibrium. But when I'm in a classroom, as you know this, Bhante, because you're a teacher as well, when you're in the classroom and you're making direct contact with students, for example, this semester I'm meeting with 10 students in person, and I'm asking for each one of them to meet with me individually, and we have an interview. We actually sit and talk about what their career, where they are in their academic work, what are their career aspirations. I have them write short essays about their, essentially autobiographies, about how they grew up and where did they grow up and what was their exposure to animals or the natural world. So when I have that direct personal contact, I have a much easier time understanding who they are. And then when I'm lecturing, I think all teachers probably do this. I hope they do. They pay attention to their classes, and they can see where somebody seem to have a puzzled look on their face or seem to be questioning something, or if they're asking questions. There's much more opportunity in person, in my experience, to interact with students than there is through Zoom. Zoom's a wonderful gift, and it got us through the COVID period. But it's not.
We have to be very grateful about that.
That's right. I am very grateful, but I don't think it's an adequate tool to get that full experience of interacting with the students.
Yeah. All right. So I think it is time for us to wind up today's talk. But as I promised, I would like to practice with Professor Tom Moritz today with the loving kindness meditation. I think that will be so wonderful. I would like to chant the Karaniyamita Sutta, and I really wish everyone, all sentient beings, including Professor Moritz and all our um, wonderful participants, and also the people who are watching this later on, and also everyone's family, friends, relatives, teachers, and elders. May all of you be well, happy, healthy, safe wherever you are. May you always be in the right path, associated with the right wonderful spiritual friends. With that, I would like to chant. I think it will not take too long, and I would like to chant short Karaniyamita Sutta, the Sutta, Discourse on Loving Kindness. And I really love to listen to Professor Moritz English chanting. Okay. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Karaniyamatha kusalena yang thang sang thang padang abhisamecha sakko jucha sujucha suacho chassa mudu anatimani santussa cha subharocha apakhicho sallahuka buddhi Saṅtindriyo ca nipako ca appagabho kulesu ananugiddho naca koddang samacare kinci yena viñño pare upavadeyam sukhino akhemino hontu sabbe satta bhavantu sukhitatta Ye kechipana bhutate tasavathavarava Dighavaye mahantava majjhimarasa kanukathola Ditthavaye addithaye cha dure vasanti avidure Bhutava sambhave siva sabbe satta bhavantu sukhitatta Naparo parang nikubbetha natimanyetha katha chinang kangchi Vyarosana patigha sanya nanyamanyasa dukkhamicheya Mata yatha niyang puttang ayusaika putta manurakhe Evang pi sabba bhutesu manasang bhavaye aparimanang Mittancha sabba lokasming manasang bhavaye aparimanang Uddhang adho cha tiriyang cha asangvadhang averang asapattang Tithang charang nisinno asayano ayavatasya vigatamidho Etang sating adhiteya brahmamethang viharang idhamaho Ditthing cha anupagamma silava dasanena sangpanno Kamesu vinayagedhang nahi jatu gabhaseyang punareti etena saccavajjena soddhite hotu sabbada Etena saccavajjena soddhite hotu sabbada Etena saccavajjena Suddhite hotu sabbada sadhu sadhu sadhu
Thank you, Bhante.
Over to you,
So,
Professor.
these are the Buddha's words on loving kindness. This is what should be done by one who is skilled in goodness and who knows the path of peace. Let them be able and upright, straightforward and gentle in speech, humble and not conceited, contented and easily satisfied, unburdened with duties and frugal in their ways, peaceful and calm and wise and skillful, not proud and demanding in nature. Let them not do the slightest thing that the wise would later reprove. Wishing in gladness and in safety, may all beings be at ease, whatever living beings there may be, whether they are weak or strong, omitting none, the great or the mighty, medium, short, or small, the seen and the unseen, those living near and far away, those born and to be born, may all beings be at ease. Let none deceive another, or despise any being in any state. Let none through anger or ill will wish harm upon another, even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child. So with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings, radiating kindness over the entire world, spreading upwards to the skies and downward to the depths, outward and unbounded, freed from hatred and ill will, whether standing or walking, seated or lying down, freed from drowsiness. One should sustain this recollection. This is said to be the sublime abiding. By not holding to fixed views, the pure-hearted one, having clarity of vision, being freed from all sense desire, is not born again into this world. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Thank you so much. That was
Thank
so
you,
wonderful.
Bhante. Thank you so much.
I really enjoyed that part as well. That was one of my favorite chantings of you.
Thank you. Blessings to all beings, huh?
Yeah. Thank you so much. And
Thank you, Bhante.
with that, we conclude today's guest lecture, and we look forward to meeting you with more interesting topics like this in the coming weeks. Please contact us if you have any interesting and useful topic. And we would also like to invite you, if you are interested in joining us in this weekly guest lecture series. I would like to invoke blessings upon Professor Tom Moritz for kindly accepting our invitation for this, for this speech. May you always be well, happy, healthy, dear Professor Tom Moritz. Let's also keep our palms together close to our heart and pray that by the power of all the Dana Sila Bhavana activities that we have performed during our lifetime and during our whole course of samsara, become one united power, and may it be shared with all the celestial beings. May all the wonderful celestial beings, including respectful Brahmas and Devas, and all sentient beings, receive this merit, share this merit, be well, happy, healthy, safe, wherever they are. May all your departed ones also receive this merit and be well, happy, healthy, safe, wherever they are. May all of us be able to live our life peacefully, comfortably, with good health. May all of us and all sentient beings be able to attain the supreme bliss of Nibbana, the absolute peace and happiness at the end of our samsara. Thinking thus, let us say 3 times Sadhu, Sadhu, Sadhu. Thank you, and see you again next week.
Thank you, Bhante.
Okay.